My wife was radiant that night, surrounded by laughter and music, raising a glass of champagne as the man next to her touched her waist with enough intimacy to make my stomach turn. She didn't know I was there. I didn't know that I was watching her from the darkest corner of that room, where distracted eyes couldn't find me. It was the party she herself had insisted we organize, a milestone of success for her, or so I was led to believe. I should have realized sooner, I should have put the pieces together, but nothing prepared me for what I saw. His hands sliding over her skin, his furtive smiles, his looks full of secrets. I held on, but in that instant, something inside me broke. Is he here? I heard his voice say in her ear, and she shook her head, laughing, as if the possibility of me showing up was absurd. As if I didn't exist. As if the life we built together was nothing more than a disposable play in the theater she had turned our marriage into. But I existed. And at that moment, more than ever. The guests turned as I stepped onto the makeshift stage, grabbing the microphone with a remote I didn't know I had. She froze. Her lover froze. Everyone else seemed stuck in slow motion, not understanding what was happening. Good evening, my voice echoed throughout the room, and the smiles began to disappear. I wanted to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate. In fact, celebrate a new beginning. Because today marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I saw her squeeze his arm, as if that would stop him from walking away, as if in that instant she realized something terrible was about to happen. She was right. Today I officially announce my divorce. The hall was silent. And I also want to take this opportunity to reassure all of you who were worried about the assets at stake. Everything, absolutely everything, will remain with me. The cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. The crowd murmured, eyes fixed on her and the man next to her, who was now taking a subtle step back, as if already anticipating the consequences of being seen next to her at that moment. I got off the stage before any of them could react. I walked past her without stopping, feeling her eyes boring into me, full of panic, despair, and maybe even regret. But regret no longer mattered. Not after all. For weeks, I had gathered evidence. Deleted messages, calls at suspicious times, poorly prepared excuses for late meetings. I knew. I knew and waited for the right moment to act. Because it wasn't just about what she did. It was about everything we destroyed together. The moments on the couch, the plans for the future, the shared dreams. Everything went up in smoke the moment I discovered that while I was fighting to build a life for us, she was already erasing me from hers. I wanted her to know what it was like to have the ground ripped out from under her feet. What it was like to feel your heart break into 1,000 pieces. I wanted her to feel the same pain I felt when I realized that the love that once brought us together had died without me even noticing. Please, can we talk? She caught up with me in the hallway, holding my arm as if her urgency could fix everything. I can explain. Explain. I laughed, a bitter, cold laugh. Explain what? That this was all a mistake. That you love me and don't know how this happened. She was silent, tears streaming from the eyes I knew so well. Eyes that, until a few hours before, I believed were incapable of deceiving me. You destroyed me. My voice was lower, almost a whisper, but carried with a weight that made her let go of my arm. Now it's your turn to watch everything fall apart. I turned and left her there, surrounded by the curious and judgmental gazes of the guests, by the shadows of what was left of her life. But as I walked out of that room, something inside me whispered that this wasn't the end. Because deep down, I knew there was still so much more to come. I knew that secrets always have a way of coming out, and hers, I was about to find out, was far worse than I could ever imagine. Welcome to the channel, where we reveal the darkest secrets and devastating consequences of betrayal. Here, we do not support, justify or romanticize infidelity. On the contrary, our fictional stories show how betrayal can destroy lives, hearts and futures. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and emotions. Fasten your seatbelts, because what you're about to hear is shocking, realistic, and impossible to forget. Good story. Golden afternoon light streamed in through the house's wide windows, painting the walls with a warm, comfortable glow. Ethan watched the reflection of the curtains gently swaying in the glass as his fingers absently twirled the wedding ring on his finger. The house was spotless, as always. The smell of scented candles still hung in the air, traces of the care that Emily, his wife, put into every detail. She always had this gift for transforming space into a welcoming refuge, a place he felt safe and proud to return to after a long day of work. He allowed himself a discreet smile as he remembered the nights they would spend on the couch, with a glass of wine and old songs playing in the background, laughing about trivial things and making plans for the future. Emily appeared in the hallway, her loose dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders and her pale dress molding her curves with natural elegance. She smiled when she saw him standing there, thoughtful, and walked over, running her hands up his arms like she used to do when she wanted his attention. He pulled her close, smelling the sweet scent that always reminded him of the first days of dating, when everything still seemed new and unbreakable. The house was big, but it never felt empty. The two had chosen that place thinking about growing up together, filling the rooms with laughter, parties and maybe even children one day. They were in no hurry, however. Emily liked to plan every step and Ethan completely trusted her intuition. From the beginning, she always knew what she wanted and seemed to have a knack for getting it. That was something he admired about her. The confidence, the determination, the way of winning people over without apparent effort. He remembered the first time he saw her. It was at a corporate event where she was surrounded by coworkers, talking excitedly about a new advertising campaign. Ethan was impressed by her presence. Emily had a magnetism that made people stop and listen and forget about time. That's how he felt that night, like there was no one else there but her. Now, years later, that presence continued to impress him. Emily always seemed in control, even in the most chaotic moments. She was admired by friends and colleagues, but to Ethan, she was more than that. She was the woman who knew how to calm him with a touch, who encouraged him when he doubted himself, and who shared his dreams without fear of failure. However, something has been hanging in the air lately. He couldn't say exactly what it was. Maybe it was just the pressures of work or the stress of responsibilities that were growing as the business expanded. Emily was also busier than ever, organizing events and making connections that could further advance her career. Ethan knew how important this was to her and tried not to resent the nights he had dinner alone or the weekends she spent busy with meetings and presentations. Still, there was a weight in his chest that he couldn't ignore. Little moments when she seemed distant, hurried glances at her cell phone and smiles that ended too quickly. He tried to push those thoughts away, remembering all the times Emily had proven herself to be loyal and dedicated. They always talked about everything, and he refused to believe anything could be wrong. That night, Emily was especially excited. He had talked about a party he was helping to organize for an important client and insisted that Ethan attend. He wasn't a fan of social events, but the way she asked, with her eyes shining and her hands squeezing his, made him relent. He wanted to see her happy, and if that meant leaving her comfort zone for a few hours, he would do it without thinking twice. While she got ready in her room, Ethan sat in the living room, thinking about how perfect their life seemed on the outside. Friends called them the ideal couple, and even strangers commented on how well-matched they were. He believed it. Or at least I wanted to believe it. But there was something about that night that made him uneasy, as if an invisible shadow was lurking around, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Emily came down the stairs with a radiant smile, and for a moment, Ethan felt his heart sink. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't decipher. A different glow, perhaps. Or was it just the light reflecting? He stood up and hugged her, trying to erase any doubts that remained in his mind. In the car, the conversation flowed lightly, like old times. Emily talked about the details of the party, the influential people who would be there and how it could open doors for future projects. Ethan listened attentively, even though he wasn't interested in the corporate world in the same way as she was. He liked seeing how her eyes lit up when she talked about work, and that was enough to make him smile. When they arrived, the party was already in full swing. Soft lights, ambient music and glasses clinking everywhere. Emily was immediately greeted by acquaintances and was soon drawn into conversations and introductions. Ethan stood a little away, watching her from afar, as he had done since the beginning. She moved with grace, laughing at the right moments and making everyone around her feel important. It was impossible not to be proud of her. But then something changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan felt it. Emily quickly looked at her watch, then at her cell phone. Her gestures became more tense, and she began to look for someone in the crowd. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just stress from the event, but the discomfort grew. When Emily finally returned to him, her smile seemed forced. Ethan tried to play, to get her to relax, but he found her mind was elsewhere. It was at that moment that he felt the first crack in what he always believed to be a solid relationship. And even though he didn't know why, something inside him whispered that that night would change everything. Ethan woke up that morning with a strange weight on his chest, an uncomfortable feeling he tried to ignore as he stood up from the empty bed. Emily had already left early, as she had been doing more frequently in recent months. He stood still for a moment, observing her side of the bed still unmade, the pillow with the light floral scent she wore. He took a deep breath and went to the shower, trying to banish the thoughts that insisted on invading his mind. The hot water ran down the body, but it didn't wash away the accumulated tension. He dressed in silence and went down to the kitchen, where he found a note she had left next to an empty mug. "Good morning, my love. I had to leave early for an important meeting. See you later. I love you." The words were comforting, but they didn't dispel the restlessness that was growing inside him. There was something wrong, but he still couldn't understand what it was. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that it was all just silly insecurity fueled by tiredness and an exhausting routine. The next few days passed in a blur. Emily was increasingly distant, her schedule became less predictable, and excuses for being late began to be repeated. First there were long meetings, then last-minute events, and soon she was even going out on the weekends. Ethan tried to ignore the discomfort, but doubts began to seep in like cracks in what seemed to be perfect glass. He began to notice how her cell phone was always nearby, how messages arrived late at night and the quick smiles she gave before hastily putting it in her bag. One night, as Emily slept soundly next to him, Ethan took her cell phone for the first time in years. He felt his hands shake as he slid the screen and saw that it was locked with a password he didn't know. They never needed secrets, or at least that's what he thought. He went back to bed and stared at the dark ceiling, listening to her calm breathing, wondering if he was going crazy or if there really was something he was ignoring. The next day, he decided he needed answers. He began to observe her more closely, noticing every detail, every unusual behavior. Emily always seemed nervous when she went out, checking her watch or touching up her lipstick more than usual. Ethan tried to subtly confront her, asking about their commitments and suggesting that perhaps they could spend more time together, but she looked away and skillfully changed the subject. Tension grew between them. Conversations became superficial, dinners in uncomfortable silence and kisses were quick, without the warmth of before. Ethan felt the void expanding between them, and the more he tried to get closer, the more Emily seemed to slip away. He began to feel like an intruder in his own home, as if he no longer belonged in that space they built together. The gala organized by Emily was the final straw. He noticed from the beginning that she was different that night. The sparkle in her eyes wasn't from him, and her laughter sounded forced. As the guests arrived and spread out across the room, Ethan stood at a distance, watching her glide through the room as if she were living in another world, a world he had no access to. That's when he saw it. Emily had her back to him, talking to a tall, well-dressed man, but there was something about the closeness between the two that made his blood run cold. His hands touched her arm in a way that was too intimate, and Emily didn't flinch. On the contrary, he smiled and lowered his head, as if trying to hide it. Ethan felt his heart racing, but he couldn't look away. He decided to wait, trying to remain calm, but with every minute that passed, the anguish increased. Emily disappeared at some point, and Ethan began looking for her. When he finally found her, she was in the outside area of the room, laughing and holding a glass of champagne next to that same man. His arm was around her waist, and they both seemed to not care about anything around them. Ethan felt something break inside him. He approached slowly, as if each step were a sentence, but stopped before he was noticed. I wanted to see where it went. And then it happened. Emily turned to the man and whispered something before he pulled her in for a quick, covert kiss. She looked around to make sure no one had seen her and laughed again, as if it were a harmless joke. But Ethan saw it. And in that moment, everything made sense. The delays, the furtive smiles, the hidden messages. There was no longer any doubt. Emily was cheating on him. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, and anger began to take over him. He wanted to cross the room, grab her arm and demand explanations right there, but something held him back. I needed more. He needed to make her feel the same shock, the same pain. He stayed there for a few more minutes, watching as she continued to act as if nothing had happened, as if he no longer existed. When he went back inside, he walked past the guests without saying a word. Every detail of the night seemed distorted now, as if he were living in a parallel reality. He picked up his phone and started typing a message, but stopped. No. This needed to be done face to face. It needed to be impactful, it needed to be unforgettable. As the hours passed, Ethan already knew what he needed to do. He planned every word, every gesture, and waited for the right moment. The party was still lively, but he no longer heard the music or saw the smiling faces. All I could think about was how the night would end. When he finally took the microphone and took the stage, everything was silent. He could feel Emily's eyes on him, could almost hear her heart racing. And the moment he started talking, I knew that would be the turning point. Nothing would be the same again. The silence in the hall seemed deafening. Emily was still, her eyes fixed on Ethan, but her expression wasn't just shock. There was fear. A fear so deep it made him wonder what else she was hiding. He stepped off the stage, pushing through the crowd that was spreading around him as if they were afraid of being too close to what was about to explode. Emily took a step back as he approached, but he didn't stop. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, and the only thing that came out was a muffled whisper. Ethan held her gaze, waiting, but all he found was desperate confusion. He turned and left the hall without looking back. He heard her quick footsteps coming up behind him and felt her hand holding his arm. He stopped, but didn't look at her. I felt her breathing quicken, her hand shaking. She tried to say something, but he let go and kept walking. Emily ran to catch up and stood in front of him, blocking his path. Please listen to me, it wasn't like that, you don't understand. He crossed his arms, looking at her as if he had never seen her before. So explain to me, convince me that all of this has a justification that doesn't destroy you even more. She hesitated, her words swallowed by tears that were beginning to well up, but Ethan didn't back down. Speak, Emily, now. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before looking at him again. I was going to tell you, I swear. I just didn't know how. I needed time. Ethan laughed, a short, bitter sound. Time. How long? Because it seems like you've already had months to make up your mind. She tried to hold his hands, but he backed away. It's not just what you think, she said, her voice breaking. It's not just about him. It's not just about betrayal. Ethan frowned, feeling his stomach drop. What are you talking about? She swallowed hard, her eyes begging him to believe what she was about to say. He knew. He felt that this went far beyond what he had already discovered, and the wait for the final blow was almost unbearable. I lied to you, Ethan. Not just about him, but about money, about possessions, about everything. She ran her hands through her hair, desperate. Me and him, we planned to take everything from you. Ethan stood still, feeling the world spin around him. Her words seemed to echo, as if they were distant, but at the same time they pierced every part of him. What? Was all he could say. She continued, speaking quickly, as if she needed to get it all out before she lost her nerve. In the beginning it wasn't like that. At first I just wanted attention, I wanted to feel desired. But after we started, he said I could have more, that I deserved more. He convinced me that you didn't value me, that I was wasting time. He said if we got the right documents, we could transfer everything into my name, and then. Ethan raised his hand, telling her to stop. You're telling me you tried to destroy me. Not just emotionally, but financially. Did you want to leave me with nothing? And that? She was crying now, tears staining her perfect makeup. I didn't want it to get this far, I swear. I was going to stop, I was going to tell you. He didn't believe it. I couldn't. All he could think about was how much he trusted her, how much he put her on a pedestal. And now, there in front of him was a woman he barely recognized. And how did you think this would end, Emily? That I would figure it out and just accept it? That I would gladly give you everything? She shook her head, desperately denying it. No, I thought you'd never find out. That I could solve everything before it got to that point. But you couldn't, right? Because in the end, you're not as good at hiding lies as you thought you were. She looked at him, defeated, as if at that moment she knew that nothing she said would be enough to erase what she had done. Ethan felt his heart heavy, his hands tingling with anger. He wanted to scream, wanted to destroy her like she tried to destroy him. But something stopped him. He walked away, leaving her there, in the shadows of the night. You've already lost, Emily. And tomorrow, when you wake up, you will realize how much. She tried to follow him, but stopped, as if she had finally realized that there was nothing more to be said. Ethan continued walking, not looking back. But even as he walked away, he felt like it wasn't over yet. She still had more secrets. And he was determined to discover them all. Ethan drove aimlessly through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it could contain the avalanche of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Emily's face remained trapped in his mind, the expression of panic mixed with guilt, the words that had come out hasty and uncontrolled, as if they could erase months of lies and manipulation. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he needed to get out of there, away from that house, that woman, that past that now seemed like an illusion built on quicksand. The phone vibrated on the next bench. He glanced over and saw her name lighting up the screen. Ignored. Soon after, another notification appeared. A message. Please find me. I need to explain everything to you. He let out a heavy sigh, fighting the urge to throw the device out the window. But something made him stop the car on the side of the road. He picked up his cell phone with shaking hands and opened the message. More desperate words. If you still care, meet me at the office. It's about him. Please. Her lover's name echoed in Ethan's mind like poison. He didn't want to see her, he didn't want to hear anything else, but something in that message aroused uneasiness. She looked scared, and not just of him. It felt like more than guilt. It was panic. Against all his instincts, Ethan turned the steering wheel and changed the path. When he arrived at the office where Emily worked, the building's lights were still on, but the parking lot was almost empty. He entered through the main door and found the sleepy receptionist who let him through without question. He went up the stairs to her room and stopped in front of the half-open door. Emily was inside, sitting at the table, her eyes red and her hands shaking over an open envelope. She looked up when she saw him enter and stood up quickly. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said, her voice low and thick. "I am here. Tell me what it is." She took the envelope and handed it to him. Ethan opened it and saw copies of bank transfers, forged contracts, documents signed in his name. Everything pointed to the diversion of money from joint accounts. His name was on all the papers, as if he had given consent. "I didn't do that." His voice was harsh. "I know," Emily replied, with pleading eyes. "But he did. And he used my access to frame you. I never wanted this to happen. He said it would just be a plan to scare you, to make you sign the divorce papers without question. But then he changed everything. He threatened me, Ethan. He said if I didn't continue, he would destroy my career and turn you against me in a way I would never recover from." Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "So you continued." "He continued lying, cheating, and even helped him ruin me." "Why?" "For money. For adventure." "For what, Emily?" She cried, the tears flowing uncontrollably. "I was scared. At first, I believed him. I believed that you never really loved me, that you were only with me out of convenience. And when I realized he was manipulating me, it was too late. I didn't know how to get out. I tried to stop, but he started chasing me, watching me. And today he appeared here." Ethan felt his body stiffen. "Was he here?" "Yes. He wants more money. He said that if I didn't hand it in by tomorrow, he would take all of this to the police and drag me along." "And you expect me to save you from this?" Emily looked at him, desperate. "I hope you help me stop him. You know what he's capable of doing. Please, Ethan, I know I messed up, but I can't deal with this alone." He looked at her, trying to find in her eyes some trace of the woman he loved, but all he saw was fear and regret. He felt anger mix with compassion, but there was no more room for trust. "I'll sort it out," he said, turning to leave. "Ethan, please wait. I still love you." He stopped, but didn't look back. "You loved power more than me, Emily. And now you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that." He walked out the door before she could respond, leaving her alone among the papers spread across the table. Ethan drove to the address he found in one of the documents and stopped in front of an old, dimly lit building. Her lover's name was registered as the person in charge of the place. He took a deep breath before getting out of the car and crossing the street. The building had a rundown look, windows covered with thick curtains and a faded "For Rent" sign. He knocked hard on the door. After a few seconds, the door opened and the man appeared. Tall, well-dressed, but with an arrogant look that made Ethan's blood boil. "I was waiting for you," he said with a mocking smile. Ethan entered uninvited, closing the door behind him. "I know everything. I know about the documents, the transfers, and the threats. This ends today." The man took a step back, but maintained his provocative tone. "And what are you going to do? Hit me? Are you going to scream? You have nothing against me. I have already taken all precautions." Ethan threw the envelope onto the table. "I have more than you imagine. And now you have two options: either you undo all this and disappear, or I hand over each of these documents to the police and take you with me to the bottom of the well." The smile disappeared from the man's face. "You won't do that. That would destroy Emily too." "Maybe it will," Ethan said, approaching. "But I'd rather risk it than let you escape." The man tried to maintain his composure, but Ethan saw the fear in his eyes. "I can pay you to forget about it." Ethan leaned in closer. "You have nothing to offer me," he finished. Before the man could respond, Ethan took the documents and left. He walked back to the car, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. He knew it was far from over, but for the first time in months he felt like he was taking back control. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone manipulate him again. Ethan felt the weight of the documents on the passenger seat as he drove through the darkness. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but his mind remained stuck on what had just happened. The man's arrogant face, the way he tried to manipulate the situation until the last second, as if he still believed he could escape unharmed. The fear in his eyes at the end, however, was enough to show that the threats had had an effect. Still, Ethan knew this was far from over. People like him rarely gave up without a fight, and this was a battle he could no longer avoid. Emily's words echoed in her head, mixing with anger and tiredness. He tried to shake off the memory of her pleading look, of the tears running down her face as she begged for forgiveness. Part of him wanted to believe that she had just been a victim at the hands of a more experienced manipulator, but another part of him refused to ignore the fact that she had chosen to play this game. She could have stopped. I could have told the truth before everything came to this. But it didn't stop. And now, they were faced with an abyss that seemed impossible to cross. Upon arriving home, Ethan parked the car and stood there for a few minutes, watching the lights on through the windows. He knew Emily was inside waiting for him. I knew that as soon as I entered, I would have to face more questions, more excuses, more confessions. He took a deep breath before opening the door and taking the first steps inside. Emily was sitting on the couch, hugging her legs to her chest, as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. The red eyes showed that he had been crying the entire time he was gone. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, but hesitated when she noticed his expression. He placed the documents on the table and turned to face her. She approached slowly, as if expecting him to back away, but he didn't move. They stayed there, facing each other, in silence, until she finally broke the tension. "Did you make it?" He nodded but said nothing. She looked relieved for a brief moment, but the look in his eyes made her freeze again. "So what happens now?" Ethan crossed his arms, struggling to control his tone. "Now you will have to deal with the consequences. That doesn't go away just because he was threatened. He can come back. He can try something else. And even if you don't try, what you did won't go away, Emily." She lowered her head, unable to look at him. I know I screwed up. I just wanted. What did I want? More money. More power. What else, Emily? Because, honestly, I still can't understand it." She lifted her head, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something different. Determination. "I wanted to be seen. I wanted to feel like I still had value, that I still mattered. But I did it in the worst way possible. And now I've lost everything." Ethan shook his head in frustration. "That's no excuse. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be important. But that's not how you do it. You knew that, Emily." "I always knew." She walked over, grabbing his hands before he could step back. "I know I don't deserve anything more from you, but I need to try to fix this. I need to face what I did. And I will face it." He pulled his hands back and took a step back. "You say this now because you are scared. Because she's desperate. But what then? When will this end? Are you going to lie again? Are you going to make plans behind my back again?" She swallowed hard, but kept her gaze steady. "No. I promise not." He wanted to believe it, but he couldn't. There was a part of him that still clung to the image of the woman he loved, the woman he built a life with, but that image was crumbling quickly. The truth was, he didn't know if he could trust her again. And as he thought about it, he realized that was the real question. It wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what he was willing to accept. Could you forgive her? Could you move forward alongside her, knowing everything that happened? Or had that been the end? Emily was still standing in front of him, waiting for an answer he didn't know if he could give. Finally, he turned around and picked up the documents again. "I'll take care of it." But I don't do it for you. I do this because I need to protect what is still mine. She nodded, tears flowing silently. Ethan went upstairs, leaving her alone in the room. My heart felt heavy, but I knew I needed space to think. I needed to decide what came next. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. He went downstairs and found Emily already dressed, holding her bag. She looked at him as if awaiting a final judgment. I'm going out for a while. I think we need space. He didn't respond. He just watched as she grabbed her keys and walked out the door. The silence that remained in the house seemed heavier than ever. Ethan sat on the sofa and looked at the documents on the table. I knew it wasn't over. He knew there were still difficult decisions ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he could handle it. He picked up the phone and started calling lawyers, banks, and contacts who could help him protect what was left of his life. Each call felt like a small victory, a step toward regaining the control I had lost. Hours later, when he finally hung up the last phone call, he looked at the door and wondered if Emily would come back. And if it came back, he would be ready to deal with it. Because this time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Ethan sat at the table in the lawyer's office, looking at the stacks of documents that would be sent to the court. The room was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking down the seconds. He had spent the last few weeks reorganizing his life, separating accounts, transferring assets and preparing for the inevitable. The decision to move on was made, but that didn't make things any easier. The pain was still there, buried beneath layers of anger and frustration, but there was also a growing determination. He wouldn't let it destroy him. Emily had left the house that morning and never returned. His messages kept coming for the first few days, begging for conversations, trying to find ways to convince him to give him another chance, but Ethan had blocked every single one of them. She tried to show up at his office, but he sent her away before she could say anything. There was nothing more to be said. He knew that any word that came out of her mouth would be a desperate attempt at manipulation, a last attempt to save herself from the ruin she herself had caused. However, ruin was already coming for her. The lawyers had filed for divorce, and Ethan made sure all the evidence was attached. Documents, transfers, and even messages exchanged between Emily and her lover were in the files. There was no way for her to escape the weight of justice. Ethan felt no pleasure in signing the papers, but he also felt no regret. He was just doing what needed to be done. News of the divorce spread quickly. Friends who once called them the perfect couple now whispered behind their backs, speculating about what had really happened. Emily lost more than one marriage. She lost contracts, lost clients, and lost the trust of people who previously admired her. The parties and events that used to be the stage for his social ascension were now behind closed doors. She tried to maintain her posture, but the marks of failure were written all over her face. The lover, in turn, did not escape unscathed. Ethan's threat was just the beginning. Further investigation revealed that he had deceived other people before, using similar schemes to take advantage of others' trust. When the evidence reached authorities, he was prosecuted for fraud and money laundering. Ethan made sure to personally deliver the documents to the prosecutor's office, ensuring he paid for every penny stolen. The trial was swift, and the man who had once thought himself untouchable was now behind bars. Emily watched everything fall apart. She tried to blame her lover for having manipulated her, she tried to play the victim to the lawyers and even to Ethan himself, but nothing worked. She was left alone, without allies, without friends and without money. He ended up moving to a small, cheap apartment, where he began to live on temporary jobs, far from the social circles he valued so much. Ethan, on the other hand, began to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy. There were lonely nights when he wondered if he had made the right choice, times when anger and resentment threatened to consume him again, but he persisted. He sought help, spoke to therapists and allowed himself to feel each emotion without letting themselves be dominated by them. Little by little, the pain gave way to something new, hope. It was during a business meeting that he met Claire. Unlike Emily, she had a calm, sincere presence. The two started out as friends, sharing experiences and stories, but over time, the connection grew into something more. Claire brought lightness to Ethan's life, something he didn't even know he needed. She made him laugh again, made him believe that true love was still possible. When he finally introduced her to his friends, the comments about Emily stopped. Everyone noticed that Ethan was different, happier, more peaceful. Claire didn't try to be perfect. She was just there, which was more than he could ask for. Emily, on the other hand, was still stuck in the past. She tried to contact Ethan again months later, but he never responded. He tried to recover his reputation, but the damage was irreversible. She became a shadow of her former self, remembered not for her successes but for the mistakes that destroyed her. Ethan watched from afar, without resentment, but also without mercy. He knew that Emily had made choices that led her here, and it wasn't his role to save her from the consequences. Instead, he focused on building something better for himself. The day he signed the final divorce documents, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was neither joy nor sadness. It was relief. He could finally move on without carrying the weight of a broken past. And this time, he knew he was in control. Now all that was left was a new beginning. If you've made it this far, we want to know what you thought of this story. Comment your opinion, share your thoughts and tell us how this narrative impacted you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. Remember, here on the channel, we do not support any type of betrayal. We show how it can destroy lives and teach that choices have consequences. Thanks for listening to the end and until the next story.